Hi there, welcome to this blog that's going to talk about journals to correct errors. My name's Gareth. In fact, you can see there my contact details, garethjohn@fi.co.uk. I'm a managing director with First Intuition. And as well as training AAT students for their assessments, I'm responsible for managing our AAT distance learning program and producing a lot of our AAT material. Please feel free if you've got any questions, whether they're technical questions about syllabus areas or questions about your general studies and your progression through AAT and even on to other qualifications, do feel free to get in touch. I've been teaching for nearly 20 years, so I've got a lot of experience and a lot of advice that I can give. Now, over the last few years, First Intuition has been awarded UK Accountancy College of the Year in both 2010 and 2012. I was very, very pleased to be awarded UK Lecturer of the Year in 2011. And more recently, we were nominated for Study Resource of the Year in 2013. Well, let's have a look at the task we're going to work through in this blog. Basically looking at creating journals to correct errors, and we've got a couple of errors we're going to worry about here. Now, one thing to be very careful about when you're looking at journals to correct errors is trying to identify whether the error that was made will affect the suspense account or not. Remember, some errors will affect the suspense account and some errors will not affect the suspense account. It basically comes down to whether the original double entry posted, whether that original wrong double entry balanced or not. If it didn't balance, so if the incorrect double entry didn't balance, then we will require a suspense account entry. If the original incorrect double entry did balance, then we won't. Well, let's have a look at the first of the errors we're going to deal with here. Well, firstly, we've got a rent payment of £500, so we've paid our landlord £500, was actually posted as £50 to the rent expense account. Now you can see what's happened there. They've obviously missed a zero off when they've posted the amount into one of the ledger accounts. Well, I think a very useful process to dealing with these sorts of tasks is to think of it in three logical steps. Start by thinking about what double entry did the business post. Now, one thing to always assume when you're thinking about this is if they don't specifically tell you that something was wrong, assume that it was done correctly. So in this example, we're told the error was they posted £50 to the rent expense account. Now, it doesn't mention anything about the cash or the bank account, so we can assume that that would have been done correctly. Now, if we're making a payment for rent, we would be crediting bank, wouldn't we? Now, if we're crediting bank by £500, we can assume here that would be done correctly. It's the posting to the rent expense that's wrong. Now, that would be the debit side of the double entry, and instead of debiting £500, they've evidently only posted £50 to it. So I think the double entry they did post was a debit to the rent expense for only £50. That's the error. They will have credited bank or cash by the full £500. Because that wasn't mentioned, we can assume that was done correctly. Now, the first thing you'll hopefully notice here is that that double entry they've posted doesn't balance. That means that at the end of the day, the trial balance wouldn't balance, and as a result, we would require a suspense account. So this is going to need a suspense account as part of the correction. But before we get to the correction, second step is to think about what double entry they should have posted. Well, they should have posted the correct £500 to the rent expense, shouldn't they? That should have been a debit to the expense of £500, and the credit, well, that should have been to bank or cash for the £500. Now, that's what they should have posted, a properly balancing double entry with the correct amount to both the expense ledger account and to the bank and cash ledger account. Now, in terms of what we therefore need to do to correct, well, let's compare these two double entries we've created, what they did and what they should have done. Now, I'm hoping you can see on the credit side, they should have credited bank and cash by 500, and they did credit bank and cash by 500. So the credit side's okay. So I don't need to touch bank and cash. It's on the debit side we made the mistake. They debited 50 to the rent expense when they should have debited 500. Now in this example, can you see the debit was way too small? So I think to correct, we're going to need a further debit to the rent expense ledger account. Now the difference is 450. We only debited 50. We needed 500, so I need to debit an additional 450 to put it right. Where's the credit side going to go? Well, as we said, we don't need to do anything to bank and cash. That was correct. What we do need to credit is the suspense account. Remember, because the original double entry didn't balance, we will now need to affect the suspense account. So we'll post a credit entry to the suspense account of 450. And if you imagine what that credit to the suspense is doing, if you look back at the original double entry, we had a 50 on the debit side and a 500 on the credit side. Now remember, when you're balancing up your trial balance, if the two columns don't balance, you'll need to put a suspense account on the smaller side, won't you? So in this case, we'd need to put a suspense account on the debit side because we only had 50 on the debit. That was the smaller entry. So you can imagine we would have set up a debit on the suspense account for 450 to balance up that wrong double entry. And if we set up a debit to the suspense account, you can hopefully imagine that this credit we're now posting is clearing that off and getting rid of it. Because remember, a suspense account is a temporary errors account which we ultimately want to get rid of. So I think my correcting double entry for error 1 is debit the rent expense by 450 to correct it to what it should have been in the first place, and credit the suspense account by 450 to get rid of the suspense that would have been originally set up. Well, what about our second error now? So rent payment of £500 was posted to the land and buildings asset account and the cash account. So again, we've paid rent to our landlord. Now that rent payment should be an expense. Now what they're telling us is they've actually posted it to the wrong T account. They posted it to the land and buildings asset account. Well, if we follow the same three-step logical process, starting by thinking about what double entry did they post? Well, they said that they posted it to the land and buildings asset account and to the cash account. Now, I think I can know what the cash account would be. That would be a credit to bank or cash for the payment of 500. We've got money going out of the bank account, so they would have credited the cash account 500. The debit side has gone to the land and buildings asset account. Now what they've done here is, rather than recognising the expense of rent, which would obviously reduce your profit, they've actually recognised an asset. Because remember, debits can be assets as well as expenses. Now this error is actually what's known as an error of principle. They've made a fairly significant error because they're recognising an asset rather than an expense. That's going to fundamentally affect the look of our accounts. That's going to change the profit that we're recognising. It's going to change the figures on the balance sheet, because what they should have done, well, they should have debited rent expense. That's what the payment actually related to. So they should have debited rent expense 500 and credited, well, they should have credited bank and cash 500. It's money going out of the bank account either way. And again, to look at the correcting journal, well, again, if you compare the two double entries we've got here, they credited bank and cash, and they should have credited bank and cash. So again, I think that side of the double entry is okay, so I don't need to touch bank and cash. What I do need to think about, though, is the debit side that we posted compared to what it should have been. They've debited the land and buildings asset. In reality, we didn't actually buy an asset. We haven't bought any property. We haven't bought any land and buildings. So actually, I need to eliminate that asset. Well, how do you eliminate a debit? Well, I'm going to credit the land and buildings asset account to get rid of that 500. That's not what we acquired. We didn't buy an asset, so we're going to cancel the debit we originally posted to the asset account. And what I actually want to recognise is the rent expense. So I'm then going to post a debit to rent expense where it should have been in the first place. So posting a debit to the rent expense of 500. So this time my correcting double entry is debit to rent expense 500 to recognise the expense we should have shown in the first place. credit land and buildings asset by 500 to cancel the original entry they would have posted. Now, one thing you'll hopefully notice is that our correcting double entry here does not require a suspense account, does it? We don't require any entries to the suspense account, and that's because the original double entry we posted, although it was wrong, it did actually balance, didn't it? We did have a debit and a credit entry, so that wouldn't have affected whether the trial balance balances, wouldn't have required a suspense account, but it was wrong, wasn't it? We'd recognise the debit in the wrong place. That's why it's an error of principle, so we just need to effectively swap where the debit is being shown. Well, I hope you found that useful, thinking about how to create journals to correct errors. So useful, I think. Follow my 3-step process. Look at the double entry they did post, remembering that if they don't specifically mention an entry, assume it was done correctly. So start by looking at the double entry they did post, then think about the double entry they should have posted correctly, and by comparing those two double entries, I always think it makes it a lot more straightforward to identify the correcting journal, and just being very careful whether your correcting journal is going to require a suspense account or not, and bearing in mind, as we've just seen there, not all correcting journal entries will affect the suspense account. But thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.